Hello, cruel world. David Copeland set off a series of nail bombs in London in 1999 over 3 consecutive weekends. He was convicted of murder in 2000 and he was sentenced to 6 concurrent life sentences. He was assessed at Broadmoor Hospital, and that was like pre-trial only, and there he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. So, what was Copeland's background? What motivated his attacks? What is my personal psychological assessment of him? And why did he go to prison eventually if he was diagnosed with schizophrenia? So this is part of a series of 7 real-life patients from Broadmoor. I know that I previously said on a video that it was 6, but it's actually 7. Simple reason being, I can't count. So I'm going to give you my professional insights and my theories as a forensic psychiatrist, drawing on my experience of actually working in Broadmoor. So for this series, I've already covered Robert Maudsley, who killed 4 people, one of whom was in Broadmoor and 2 of whom who were in prison. I've also already talked about Ronnie Kray, who's like a celebrity gangster who was big in the 60s, who's diagnosed with schizophrenia. So go check out those videos. This channel is a Psych for Sore Minds. It's the only YouTube channel that covers both true crime and mental illness and the overlap between the two. And it's hosted by a professional consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. So David Copeland. First, I'm going to tell you a bit about his crimes, and then we'll go back and talk about his background because I believe that it's all connected. So David Copeland, he killed 3 people and injured 140 more. And that was through 3 successive weekends in April 1999. He made nail bombs and he planted them in Brixton, which is in South London, in Brick Lanes, which is in Spitalfields, East London, and the Admiral Duncan pub, which is a gay bar in the West End. And these bombs contained about 1,500 4-inch nails inside a hole door. So the first bomb was set off on Saturday the 17th of April 1999. It was actually found by Brixton market traders where he left it, and they saw Copeland acting suspiciously. So one of them moved it around and it ended up next to a branch of Iceland, which is where it exploded. So for foreign viewers, Iceland supermarket is associated with like cheap, low quality frozen food, not to be confused with the country Iceland, which is associated with volcano lavas and tall, beautiful people. So police arrived at the scene just as the bomb was being detonated and 48 people were injured. Exactly a week later, on Saturday the 24th of April 1999, a second bomb was also found by a man, and this man brought the bomb to a police station in Brick Lane, which was shut at the time, so the bomb exploded in his car and it injured 13 people. And as my mother always told me, if you ever find a bomb, don't put it in your car. And I used to think she was just kidding. The third bomb was on the Friday the 30th of April, and that was in the Admiral Duncan, which is a gay bar. And the pub manager was looking at it and investigating it when it exploded, and it killed 3 people and it injured 79 people. So now let's look a little bit at Copeland's background. He was born on the 15th of May, 1976, which means that he shares the same birthday as Andy Murray, the Scottish tennis player. Since he's won Wimbledon, I like to call him British rather than Scottish though. So his father was an engineer, his mother was a housewife, and apparently he struggled with his own homosexuality. That's David Copeland, by the way, not Andy Murray, who I'm sure is very comfortable with his own sexuality. So Copeland began listening to heavy metal bands. He failed in a series of jobs, and significantly he blamed immigrants for this due to the difficult job market. And then he became involved in petty crime. He was drinking, he was abusing drugs, and he was a neo-Nazi. And eventually he worked as an assistant engineer in London Underground. Apparently Copeland had a higher than average IQ, and he's a former member of the BNP. So for those of you that don't know, the BNP is the British National Party. It was founded about 38 years ago. It's an extreme right-wing party, and it believes that only white people should be citizens of the UK. As the great philosopher Indiana Jones once said, Nazis, I hate those guys. The BNP also opposes feminism and LGBT rights. So it's no coincidence that the nail bombs were aimed at Black, Bengali and LGBT communities. The BNP, by the way, is not to be confused with a French international banking group of the same name who, as far as I'm aware, don't have any racist policies. Copeland also had sadomasochistic dreams from the age of about 12, so he would fantasize about using women as slaves. So obviously this all indicates that he was disturbed from an early age. And then at the age of around 21, he saw his GP and he was given antidepressants. So what were the factors that led to Copeland deciding that he wanted to plant these bombs? Well, Copeland told the police himself that this was a racial war. So he was hoping that immigrants would fight back and that this would lead to more white people voting for the BNP. And he had deeply ingrained homophobia, I think. So I think he internalized his anger and his frustration at not being able to find jobs because in his view of the job market being threatened by immigrants, and also his not being able to cope with his own uncertain sexuality, and he did all of this in a very unhealthy way. And then on top of all of that, you add to the mix a background of depression, which can make the sufferer angry and bitter, and also make them not care about the consequences of their actions or about the future. And then in addition to all of that, you throw in alcohol use, which is renowned for making some people quite disinhibited and aggressive. So the next question is, why was Copeland sent to Broadmoor? Well, I think his act was so kind of extreme that he was just sent there for an assessment. So he went for a pre-trial remand section of the Mental Health Act called Section 4849, as opposed to like a long-term rehabilitation section for the future, which is called a Section 37. And I think that's not unreasonable. I mean, as I said before, he had sadomasochistic dreams. He saw his GP at the age of 21 and needed antidepressants. So he did have like a mental health history. Whilst he was at Broadmoor, he was diagnosed by 5 different psychiatrists as having paranoid schizophrenia. And one psychiatrist said that he just had a personality disorder. So this begs the question, if he had this diagnosis of schizophrenia, why did he end up going to prison? So at the Old Bailey, Copeland pleaded manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, but this was not accepted by the court, and that would have been related to evidence given by forensic psychiatrists. So I myself have given evidence as an expert witness, including at the Old Bailey, including murder trials. And what I would say is that diminished responsibility, basically what it boils down to was, if Copeland did have a mental illness, such as schizophrenia, that in itself is not enough. You have to look at whether it absolved him of his criminal responsibility. So specifically for this defense, that would be understanding his conduct, being able to form a rational judgment, and to exhibit self-control. So if the judge or jury agreed that one of those abilities was non-existent, then he would have been charged with manslaughter, not murder. So for example, in another set of circumstances, if Copeland was like having paranoid delusions or hearing voices about immigrants or about gay people killing the rest of the population, and he genuinely believed that everybody's life was in danger and he had to set these bombs off to save society, then it's feasible he might have got that psychiatric defense. By the way, just to go off-piste slightly randomly, I once assessed a man a couple of years ago who had these paranoid delusions against the Citizens Advice Bureau, and he had planned to set off a bomb in the office, and he had loads of arguments with them, and he was charged with harassment because he sent them death threats through emails. And after he was arrested, the police raided his flat and they actually found bomb-making equipment there. So obviously this prevented a potential huge atrocity. I just mention this because it reminds me of the Copeland case. So if Copeland did have severe symptoms of schizophrenia, then the crucial element is whether they directly affected his actions. But there would have been a potential alternative, which is not guilty by reason of insanity. So that's different in that diminished responsibility changes murder to manslaughter, whereas not guilty by reason of insanity is for any offence, not just murder. And it leads to you being technically innocent in the eyes of the law. Although in this kind of case, at this level of severity, even though you're technically innocent, you still are very likely to end up in Broadmoor for long-term rehabilitation. The other thing that I think is relevant that should be mentioned is that even though Copeland had schizophrenia can and is treated in prison. Most prisons have a mental health in-reach team, and they have a psychiatrist in that team. So I used to work in that very position. And what we would do is we'd prescribe medications to patients. And if a lot of people with schizophrenia can be managed in prison. And sometimes if they become very agitated, then further down the line, they might need hospital transfer. And the other difference is that you can't force medications onto a prisoner, whereas you can under the Mental Health Act via injections in hospital. So the decision made by the judge is that he must remain in prison for at least 50 years. So the earliest possible release would be 2049, by which time, hopefully, we'll all be out of lockdown. By the way, just as a random aside, in June 2014, Copeland attacked an inmate at HMP Belmarsh with a shiv, and then he pleaded guilty to wounding with intent, so he had another 3 years added on to his sentence. So before we continue, I've actually got a question of my own for you, dear viewers, and that is this. How much do you think it cost to treat each patient in a high secure hospital such as Broadmoor for a year? I will tell you the answer later on in this video, and I would be impressed if you can get within 20%, because the figure is going to make your eyes water. My experience of working in Broadmoor, I should state that I was only there 1 day a week for about 7 months. So I did that as a specialist registrar as a placement when I was training to become a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I was actually given the option of working there on a daily basis for either 6 months or a year, but I actually had a young baby at home with my wife, and the commute for me would have been 3, possibly 4 hours a day, so it just wasn't going to happen. The first thing that struck me about Broadmoor was the huge gates and the kind of level of security. So there was like airport style searches for every single member of staff on the way in. So I was used to working in secure, medium secure units, but nowhere near this level of security. As another example, there were CCTV cameras all over the hospital, which I'd never seen before. And there were members of staff who were employed simply just to watch CCTV all day. I worked in one of the high dependency unit wards for very disturbed patients. In fact, there was only one step above that, which is the intensive care ward. So the patients on my ward, most of them were in long-term seclusion, which meant they were so dangerous that they were kept in a cell for most of the day and let out into communal areas for 1 or 2 hours a day. It's very different from the rest of the hospital, where the patients are encouraged to be up and about and engaging in rehabilitation. So most of the patients that I saw were extremely unwell. Most of them were very paranoid. They all had a history of very severe violence. Most of them were acutely psychotic, even with lots of powerful antipsychotic medications. Some of them were hearing voices. They had a whole range of delusional, paranoid beliefs. For example, there was one man who was convinced that he was going through a sex change and that the doctors were forcing this with the medication they were giving him. What I thought was quite interesting was that at least half of the patients there had previously killed, and probably about half of them had beefs or previous fights with another patient at some point, which meant that the nurses had to plan carefully who could go out to the communal areas at the same time. So they had to be extremely well organised. And I have to say, I thought the nurses in Broadmoor were extremely good, really efficient, hard workers. They knew their patients inside out, which was different to some of the medium secure units I worked in. In the other units, there were a lot of agency nurses, lots of bank staff coming and going, and often the nurses didn't know the patients that well. The other thing that struck me about Broadmoor was the high level of observation. So if I went to see one of the patients just to have a general chat, just to catch up on their mental state, there would always be one member of nurse whose sole role was to sit on the other side of a perspex window and keep an eye on me and the patient to make sure that I was safe. Obviously, we all held like alarms on our belts, which is the same as all secure units. The other thing that struck me about Broadmoor, it was very spacious and very quiet. So there was several minutes walk just between one part of the site or one building to another part. I should say that it's been revamped, so it's a different building than when I was there. So it was actually eerily, kind of spookily quiet, and patients were mostly relatively calm. And there were obviously sudden outbursts of violence, but there wasn't an underlying kind of menace of regular violence. It was just sudden outbursts. And oddly, ironically possibly, I felt safer in Broadmoor than I did in the medium secure units where I'd worked before. And that's because the medium secure units are a lot busier and they feel more chaotic because patients are encouraged to kind of move around. There's a free flow. Another memory that really sticks out from my time in Broadmoor was the CPA meeting. So that's like a 6-monthly progress meeting that all patients have. It's like a long-term, like a lengthy meeting where you get nurses, psychologists, doctors, social workers. So the whole team of professionals collects together with the patient and they speak, and the patient's family, and they speak at length about the progress for the last 6 months. So that's quite common. But what struck me is that we had this one patient who actually had to come in with a nurse on each arm, kind of, I wouldn't say restraining him, but just with their arm sort of gently over each of his arms for the entire time, like the 2 hours that they were sat down, because he had the potential to lash out. And he was nervous, but he wasn't particularly agitated. But he literally couldn't help himself because he was constantly hearing voices telling him to attack other people. So he wasn't like an angry, hostile, intentionally nasty man. He was actually quite nervous. I actually felt quite sorry for him because you could see in his face that he was quite distressed, but he's hearing these voices and he couldn't control himself. And if anything, to me, he looked nervous about hurting other people. And I just remember the whole situation being bizarre. I'd never seen a CPA meeting with 2 nurses that would physically sit with somebody for that length of time. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my previous question, which I asked you, which was how much do you think it costs to treat each patient in a high secure unit for a year? And the answer is, drum roll please, £250,000, which is about $350,000, or is about 5 parking tickets if you live in London. So I give you props if you guessed within 20%. 20% would be $208,000 to $300,000. If you got it, you should leave a comment below to let me know. So the obvious question is, where does that money go? Well, it's mostly for security. So you've got these big locked magnetic doors, you've got all these high fences, reinforced windows. The rooms are specially designed. So for example, they don't have any ligature points where people can hang themselves. There's specialist furniture that's all bolted down or heavy, so it can't be taken apart or thrown or used to injure somebody else. And the second cost is staff. So you've got all these nurses, doctors. On top of that, you got security staff who, as I said before, are paid to watch CCTV. David Copeland was clearly a disturbed individual. He killed 3 and injured 140 complete random strangers. His actions were clearly driven by hatred, racism, fascism, and homophobia, and possibly also by depression and substance misuse. He did try his luck at the Old Bailey. He tried to reduce his charges using the psychiatric defense of diminished responsibility, but it didn't work. He ended up where he should be, which is in prison. And he won't be released until at the absolute earliest, the year 2049. So that should give Copeland plenty of time to reflect on his behaviors and his attitudes and hopefully come out as somebody who is rehabilitated. I am in the middle of doing this series about real life patients from Broadmoor. If you see my other videos, you'll know that I've already done Robert Maudsley and Ronnie Cray. So Robert Maudsley was a man who killed 4 people, 1 in the community, 1 after his transfer to Broadmoor, and then later 2 after he was transferred to prison. Ronnie Cray is a famous celebrity gangster from the 60s who had schizophrenia. So go and check them out. They are great videos, but obviously I would say that I'm a bit biased. Later on in this same series, I'm going to talk about Charles Bronson. I'm going to talk about Kenneth Erskine, otherwise known as the Stockwell Strangler, and also about the Yorkshire Ripper. In each episode, I'm going to give you my personal insights from my professional experience, including when I worked at Broadmoor. The next person in this series is going to be Robert Napper. I just want to give a quick shout out to my boy Joshua Miles. He has an excellent true crime YouTube channel. So if you're a true crime fan, then you need to check his channel out, show him some love and subscribe. Speaking of which, if you are not subscribed to this channel, that's something else you need to do. Not only by subscribing do you help me out immeasurably, but it actually makes you more attractive to the opposite sex. Or the same sex, whatever floats your boat. I'd be very grateful if you guys could comment a bit more. I love to chat to you. Been having some interesting chats recently. Follow us on Instagram, like our Facebook page, and if you've got any questions or any ideas for an episode that you'd like to submit, you can go to our email address, which is psychforsoreminds@gmail.com. If you're going to reference us, use the hashtag #PsychSore. Please tell your favorite people about Psych for Sore Minds, because they deserve it. Spread the love. Until next time, stay euthymic, and whatever you do, do not forget, I love you.